economic development. We will have a few brief remarks from the ministers, and then we'll take questions, first from the floor and then on Zoom. So please use the raise hand function if you wish to ask a question. Ministers, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Boris. J'ai remarqué que vous avez bien dit bref, alors on va essayer de se tiendre à cette consigne-là. Bonjour, good morning, everyone. This morning, as you know, the Prime Minister left for Atlantic Canada to speak directly with those communities affected by the recent hurricane. As the Prime Minister has said, the Government of Canada is always ready to assist provinces in the cleanup and recovery efforts that will take place not only over the coming days, but over the coming weeks and months. As my colleague, Minister Anita Anand and Minister Hajdu will outline, the Government of Canada has already deployed significant resources to the affected areas. Nous serons là pour aider les communautés.
We will be there to help the communities affected by this disaster to get back on their feet. The work started with our provincial counterparts will continue in the next few days and weeks, and surely in the course of the next few months. We all have the objective of helping our fellow citizens to get back to a normal life as quickly as possible. I myself have had various exchanges, including this morning, with the premiers of the Atlantic provinces, and discussions will continue consistently over the next few days. And during the next few weeks, I have started conversations already with the premiers regarding collaborative reconstruction and working together in the next few months to make sure that we proceed fast.
With our provincial counterparts, and will continue to do so in the coming days and coming weeks as Atlantic Canadians and those in Eastern Quebec get through this most difficult time. I also want to conclude by thanking many of our caucus colleagues, the members of Parliament who have been in the region, in their communities, in their constituencies, helping their fellow citizens recover from this disaster and sharing with us insights as to what the Government of Canada can do to be the best partner possible. They are in many ways the eyes and the ears of our government in those communities, and their input has been very valuable to the Prime Minister, to all of us, and to our government as we do everything we can to support those communities. So with that, I'll pass the microphone to my colleague, the Minister of National Defence. Anita.
Thank you so much, Dom. Good morning, everyone. As the devastating effects of Hurricane Fiona across the Atlantic provinces and eastern Quebec continue to be felt, our Canadian forces continue to provide support to provincial and local authorities as well as other emergency responders. The support includes regular force and reserve force personnel, as well as Canadian Rangers from the Atlantic region, many of whom are working in their home communities. Les commandants locaux des forces armées canadiennes.
Local commanders of the Canadian Armed Forces are in constant collaboration with provincial and local authorities because the situation on the ground continues to quickly evolve.
From the Chief of Defence Staff, General Eyre, early this morning, where he confirmed that we now have over 100 Canadian Armed Forces deployed in each of the 3 provinces that we have received requests for assistance from. I would now like to update you on the specific work that our Canadian Armed Forces are doing in each of those provinces, Nova Scotia, PEI, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Nova Scotia. As I noted yesterday, Canadian Armed Forces members are already on the ground in Nova Scotia, helping to clear debris from bridges, roads, and power lines. Operating out of the Victoria Park Armories on Cape Breton Island, the members are drawn primarily from the 5th Canadian Division, 36th Canadian Brigade Group Direct Response Company. In addition, a domestic response company of Canadian Armed Forces reservists has been set up in Cape Breton and is now working closely with emergency management personnel to see how the Canadian Armed Forces can continue to assist throughout the province. Le Bureau de gestion des urgences de la
Nova Scotia's Disaster Management Office has identified a community as an area that could need additional support.
Yesterday evening, we received a request from the province for more Canadian Armed Forces members to help clear debris, and we have approximately 150 Canadian Armed Forces members there to further assist, and we will continue to be on hand. Moving now to Prince Edward Island. Canadian Armed Forces support is already making a difference in Prince Edward Island, also working around the clock yesterday and continuing with their efforts today. Our Canadian Armed Forces members are helping PEI's Department of Transportation and Infrastructure with removing debris from roadways so that the power grid can be restored. This means that communities that have been cut off by the storm are closer to being reconnected and receiving the support they need. Nos militaires aident également.
Our soldiers are also helping to repair roads when necessary to make sure that isolated communities are not cut out or cut away from the rest of the province.
Supported by approximately 150 Canadian Armed Forces members, primarily from 5th Canadian Division Support Base Gagetown 4 Engineer Support Regiment. Moving now to Newfoundland and Labrador. In Newfoundland and Labrador, HMCS Margaret Brooke arrives in Francois this morning, where the ship's crew will be conducting wellness checks in hard-hit areas. As part of these wellness checks, what CAF members are doing is that they're going in, they're speaking to the local communities affected, they're assessing their needs, they're helping to move people away from damaged and high-risk homes, and they're being as helpful as possible. Les forces armées canadiennes sont aussi.
The Canadian Armed Forces are also present in the west of Newfoundland, in Stephenville, where they're also working with the local authorities to help coordinate restoration efforts as well as helping to remove debris.
I'd like to say that I've been in touch with the premiers affected, Premiers Houston, Fury, and King, and I will continue to be in close contact with provinces, my colleagues across government, and other partners to ensure that our Canadian Armed Forces continue to provide the best possible support as a result of Hurricane Fiona. And I want to say in closing that our Canadian Armed Forces have, and they will continue to be there to rise to the challenge to assist Canadians in their time of need. Nos militaires vont travailler 24 heures.
Our armed forces members will be working 24/7 for as long as they need to during these extremely difficult moments.
Miigwech. I'll now pass the parole to Minister Hajdu. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. There have been 13 communities affected by Hurricane Fiona, 13 Indigenous communities, and indeed the leadership of these communities were extremely prepared and mobilized as the storm arrived. Nonetheless, there has been damage to infrastructure and certainly deep concern about the lack of access to a secure source of power. My office and I have been in constant and direct communications with the chiefs across the Atlantic and have a better understanding of each community. And although the communities are still assessing the significant infrastructure damage, particularly to buildings and fishing boats and wharfs, their focus remains right now on the health and safety of community residents as they get through this particularly acute time. Indigenous Services Canada is engaged with emergency operations centers and other partners to ensure that First Nations are receiving the supports and supplies that they need. both last week as they prepared for the arrival of the storm and certainly now as they recover. Services aux Autochtones Canada collaborait avec les centres.
Indigenous Services Canada is working in collaboration with emergency services and other partners to make sure that First Nations people receive what they need last week to prepare for the storm.
First Nations leaders. As I said, their focus now is on ensuring the secure supply of gasoline and other fuel to ensure that the generators can continue to operate. They're also focused on making sure that there are sufficient warming centers in communities so that people without access to heat can stay warm and stay safe. They're also focused on making sure that food supply continues to be available to community members, including hot meals to many of the members that might be elderly. I have spoken with my colleagues and certainly ensured the need to keep First Nations communities prioritized in terms of access to fuel supplies. I think that is probably their main concern right now, but they are focused as well on the recovery of their fishing supplies and boats, in particular as it relates to their ongoing livelihood. So we will continue to work with the communities on their immediate needs. I've reassured them that through our emergency management assistance program, that the current costs they're incurring, as well as future costs related to infrastructure repair and other kinds of relief measures, will be covered through Indigenous Services Canada. Thank you.
Is it time to take questions or? Yeah.
My colleague. Which? Hutchings, okay. The Minister Hutchings. Can you hear me, Goody?
Goody, go ahead.
Thank you, colleagues. Good morning, everyone, again from Port of Ask. Look, first and foremost, I want to thank my friend and colleague, dear friend and colleague, Seamus O'Regan, the Minister of Labour, for coming over to join me here on the ground. Means a lot to the communities here to show that we're engaged and reaching out. The Premier and his team arrived yesterday as well. So the boots on the ground are incredible to see. Anita, thank you to you and your team for having people out. We met with a lot of the Rangers this morning. And again, seeing and hearing the stories are just heartbreaking and wrenching, but the resilience of people is strong. And the stories continue to just bring tears to everyone's eyes. We met with a gentleman this morning who literally fought for his life as he was being towed away by the undertow and pulled himself out, lived on this shore all his life, said, I can never live here again. The mayor and his council and all the local mayors that have been impacted by this are just showing such strength. And look, working together, we will build a plan for the immediate, the short term, of course, making sure that people are safe, they have food and clothing and shelter. And then as we build back better, we'll all work together. And again, I still have to thank every day the volunteers for doing such incredible work, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, all the service clubs. And friends, the donations that are coming in from across the country are just shattering. It is amazing what's coming in. Thank you. I know there's a truck coming across the island today from local farmers from all across Newfoundland with fresh produce to give to the food bank here. And I want to give a special shout out to our caucus colleagues. They've been reaching out personally and making donations to support this area of the riding that's been smashed. I'm going to take Minister O'Regan this afternoon and take him out to the outlying areas to see the other damage and again, show the support that we have. We will be building back better. We will be building back stronger. We will be building back to face these climate impacts that are facing us more and more. And together, working with the municipalities, the province, and the federal government, we will be there for people in this riding. Thank you. Back to you, Dom.
Alors à vous, Boris.
Merci, thank you. We will take questions first from the floor and then on Zoom. If you are online, you can use the raise hand function. We'll go to you after the few questions here on the floor. Vous pouvez utiliser la fonction lever la main sur Zoom et nous vous donnerons la parole après les questions ici dans la salle. Première question, Émilie Bergeron.
First question, Émilie Bergeron, La Presse Canadienne. Good morning. My first question goes to Minister Anand. Yesterday, you said that additional resources could be sent to the Canadian Armed Forces if necessary. Now you've just said that there are more than 100 or so in each of the provinces. At this point, do you anticipate that there will be others sent? And now for the Magdalen Islands, what have you heard about the rangers when it comes to their needs?
Je vais commencer et donc,
I will start, and after that, I'll give the floor to my colleague, Minister Lebouthillier. First of all, you are right that we have more than 100 soldiers on the ground in each province, as I said during my remarks. At the same time, the situation is evolving. In Nova Scotia, for example, we have about 150 soldiers on the ground there. And the same thing for Prince Edward Island. And if the situation evolves there, it's also evolving in Newfoundland and Labrador. As I said, we have not only the soldiers on the ground, but also the Margaret Brooke frigate that is there this morning working with the soldiers. And everyone there in Newfoundland will take care of wellness checks. So the situation is different in the different provinces. Requests for assistance are somewhat different as well. So we must be able to change our strategy if it becomes necessary. But at this point, we have already increased the number of soldiers on the ground in each of the provinces. Furthermore, about the Magdalen Islands with the rangers. The rangers are present in all provinces. They are our ears and eyes on the field. At this point, there is no request for assistance from the province of Quebec, but we are ready, of course, to respond with soldiers if such a request arrives, if there is need to deploy resources, soldiers. Canadian Armed Forces are there for all provinces, including the province of Quebec. That being said, I will now give the floor to Diane. Thank you very much, Anita. First of all, the people in the Magdalen Islands are united with their brothers and sisters of the Atlantic provinces. Yesterday, I had discussions with the substitute mayor and those representing fishers associations, and they all said to what extent the mayor was heartbroken on Saturday. Oh, well, the sea. It must have been frightening for people living by the sea, the people in Newfoundland, the people of New Brunswick, the people of the Atlantic provinces. How difficult it must have been for them to experience what they did over the weekend. For the Magdalen Islands, right now we are at the cleanup phase. We do not need the Canadian Armed Forces. The priority for them right now is what is happening at Port au Basque and in Nova Scotia. So they are very united with their brothers and sisters of the Atlantic provinces. Follow-up question maybe for Mr. LeBlanc. During your opening remarks, you said that Ottawa will be there to help communities to get back on their feet. Does this include assistance for businesses and entrepreneurs who are particularly affected? Because for them, it could take months for them to get back on their feet after this experience. Answer. In principle, we are open to all conversations with provincial authorities who have the responsibility to start conversations on the appropriate assistance needed by the governments. Let's think of the fishing industry, for example. In New Brunswick, for example, this is the last month of the season. Harvesters were forced to take out their vessels from the waters, and lots of these things were lost. And it's the same thing all over the Atlantic. What will the government do to help them recover the significant economic losses suffered? So this is a conversation we would like to have. Well, in this case, with the harvesters. As for the businesses affected, in my conversations with the premiers of the provinces, Mr. King went to in Prince Edward Island. They are looking forward to sitting down with us when the emergency of the cleanup, restoring electricity, as Diane and Anita said. When that critical phase is over, we will immediately move on to reconstruction of infrastructure. But in a broader sense of the word, there's economic infrastructure, there are businesses that are essential for the economic survival of these regions already economically weakened. So we will be there to engage in those conversations. I'm not excluding any form of support for those people, but we need to do that in collaboration with the local and provincial authorities. I am very encouraged with the openness we've seen so far from the partner governments, and I expect that to be efficient and rapid and generous.
Question for Minister Anand, just following on Emily's question about the size of the deployment. What you're describing basically one platoon approximately per province over a large amount of territory. And I'm just confused about why there are not more troops on the ground to help, given the magnitude of the destruction and the wide area that it covers. Is it because there isn't demand, there's not the work for them to do there, or is it because you don't have the troops ready to deploy?
It is not the case that we don't have the troops ready to deploy. In fact, it's not just one platoon, it's at least three platoons and possibly up to 6 platoons per province. So we're up to 150 from 100 per province at the current time, which is an augmentation, obviously. But the way in which the Canadian Armed Forces are operating is in conjunction with first responders, local volunteers, the province, and the Red Cross. And so it's an all-hands-on-deck effort with those various organizations in partnership with the cleanup. So as tasks arrive for the Canadian Armed Forces, we obviously deploy them to those tasks, as mentioned in the RFA, so clearing debris and assisting with downed telephone lines, et cetera. And we do that obviously in conjunction with hydro authorities, because we don't want any untoward and very negative experiences as a result of that activity. But we got to keep making sure that we're responding to the needs of the province. So that's accounts for the augmentation in the number of troops, and the situation is evolving. And so we just have to make sure we're revisiting the situation on the ground on a minute-by-minute basis, which is what we're doing.
Call for Minister LeBlanc. Essentially an evergreen story in Canada is massive flood damage, people's homes wiped out, and not having insurance coverage. Have you had any discussion with your provincial counterparts about possibly creating some kind of government backstopped national flood insurance program? Because the private insurance is very expensive and hard to get, as you know. Is there any consideration, because we're going to see more and more of these things in the future, that there'll be a role for the federal government there?
So the short answer to the question is yes. This is an ongoing conversation with provincial authorities and with the insurance industry. I know my colleagues at the Department of Finance, for example, and Minister Blair's department have been in those conversations. You're absolutely right. These kind of events, sadly, are going to become more frequent and more destructive. If it's flooding or storm damage from hurricanes, it can also be wildfires. Obviously, the insurance industry is going to be less and less willing, or at an expensive, at a rate of premium that people won't be able to afford, to cover these losses. So there is a role for public authorities. Provincial governments, again, and under our constitutional system, have responsibility for property and civil rights. But we share that responsibility over the last number of decades in the disaster financial arrangements agreements. So I have said to premiers, in terms of the particular damage of the last few days, as they assess the needs and as they accept the responsibility they have to determine the kind of compensation and the kind of coverage that's appropriate for the personal losses that many families have suffered. Obviously, the Government of Canada will be there to share the financial aspect of that compensation. So there's a short-term need for the provincial governments in partnership with us to identify the appropriate way to help people with these losses. But you're absolutely right. There's a broader conversation that feels more reassuring than using a disaster financial arrangements mechanism after the fact to cover these personal losses. So we're prepared to do both, and I'm quite encouraged by the interest of the insurance industry as well to identify the best way. They don't want to keep having these claims or these very unhappy customers. It's not good for the insurance industry, so everybody needs to find the best mechanism, recognizing that this is a direct function of extreme weather events that, as you said, are unfortunately not going to diminish over the coming months.
Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada.
Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada. I would like you to say this in French. Your government has already promised a lot of money for climate change adaptation. I think it was about 4 billion. So what form will that assistance take when it comes to insurance companies? Will it be a publicly financed regime? Answer. You had about 2 questions in that, Louis. As Minister of Infrastructure, you must have noted that I have funds and programs in partnership with municipalities and provinces. Of course, when it comes to adapting to climate change, increasing the resilience of some infrastructures, 20 minutes away from my home in Moncton, I saw the needs in terms of resilience and adaptation to more extreme temperatures. So these are funds that we have as a Department of Infrastructure. I hope that we can increase that financial offer in the course of the next few months and the next few budgets to make sure that we are there as much as possible. That includes public infrastructure. When you talk about private losses, be it homes or businesses, this is a different circumstance. The needs for families and entrepreneurs are also critical. My colleagues at Finance and Public Safety are having discussions with the industry, the insurance industry, associations of insurance companies, I believe. And there again, provinces have to be partners because essentially it is their jurisdiction, such private losses. But if we can reach an agreement or a solution with the industry and with the provinces, we'll be there. We do recognize that the public authorities have a role to play, and this is becoming increasingly so to reassure our citizens we'll be there as a national government. I'm very encouraged so far by the discussions I've had with the provincial premiers. They themselves recognize the fact that some of the losses are not insured, and that in the federal-provincial agreements, there's a place for appropriate compensation, and we'll work on that quickly. Question, I would like to talk about Roxham Road again. We have a colleague who told us this morning that the bill was about $500 million for all sorts of infrastructure, including local infrastructure. I have a 2-pronged question. Are we thinking of leaving those infrastructures there and allowing flow there for years? Second part of the question, why are there contracts that are hidden and not publicly revealed? Those expenses are not publicly revealed. Why? Answer, as you very well know, the asylum request system in Canada should be robust, humane, and must respect the rules of law. So we do have installations and competent legal frameworks to handle those requests for asylum. I know that my colleague, Marco Mendicino, is working together with the United States, the American authorities, to reach a third-party agreement. This is a discussion that is proceeding well, I believe. We need to find an agreement with the United States when it comes to reducing or handling those circumstances. Over the past few months, the various services, border services, the RCMP set up some installations, and these are decisions that are made by public safety authorities on the ground. These are not political decisions. So we are not the ones telling the border services or the RCMP to set up installations at specific areas and dictating this surface area. So these decisions are taken by the local public safety authorities, but we recognize the need for strengthening the confidence of Canadians in our asylum system, in our immigration system, and we are taking charge of that responsibility, and I believe that we'll do so in the appropriate way.
Yes, thank you. Wanted to look a little bit further ahead. Right now, there's a disaster financial assistance arrangement review, I think, going on that Minister Blair has launched. Wondering if you can provide an update on that, if you have any information, and how how you're anticipating changing that arrangement, as well as what work, if any, is going on with the disaster mitigation and adaptation strategy.
So my colleagues may want to add something, but the first part of your question, the disaster financial arrangements, agreements have existed for decades. Obviously, the needs evolve over the years, and the scale of the financial arrangements have obviously increased. We don't have to think too far back to some of the wildfires in Alberta or British Columbia, the floods in British Columbia, in my own province of New Brunswick. Some years ago around the St. John River, there were hundreds of millions of dollars of losses. So this is an existing well-worn path between provincial and federal authorities. There's built into that a sort of a review that takes place at certain defined periods. I know Mr. Blair has been leading that conversation with provincial authorities. The main takeaway, and the Prime Minister spoke about this yesterday, I have spoken to provincial premiers in recent days and in the last number of hours on precisely that. It's obvious that this arrangement needs to be modernized in the sense that the losses, the scale of losses, the type of damage, including to personal property that, as your colleague said, in some cases are not insurable or easily insurable. We need as governments to find the right way to protect Canadians. So the immediate sort of path will be a provincial request according to the agreements that exist under that long-standing arrangement. But we're prepared to discuss with the provinces the way to modernize, the way to make it more accessible, in some cases to expedite, because in some cases it can be frustrating for people. And then there's the broader question of what can we do with the insurance industry and provincial governments as well, to ensure that there are different options for coverage that would exist for private homeowners or for small business people. So those are the kind of discussions that we're happy to have. The Government of Canada doesn't have the only role in that conversation. There are proper roles for private sector providers as well as provincial authorities, but the sort of status quo that may have existed for the last 20 years doesn't feel like the right posture for the next number of years. So we're prepared to figure out the best way to reassure Canadians that they're not going to be alone when they suffer what are catastrophic losses in some cases, and certainly not because of something that they've done. If you live along the shoreline in Prince Edward Island or in Port-au-Basque or aux Îles de la Madeleine, it's this is devastating for communities and those families. We've all spoken to people who understandably are facing these huge losses. So the governments, plural, need to be there to support these people. But we need to find a more ongoing, reliable way to do that, and that's what we're working on.
And obviously the financial and economic damage to communities and individuals is significant, but clearly if this is going to continue to happen, this is going to put big time pressure on provincial and federal government in terms of financial costs as well. How are you like accounting for this? Is this a concern as we're looking at this and the pressures that this is going to put on the government's economic situation or fiscal situation?
Sure. I mean, the government is always looking at using taxpayers' money in a responsible way, but this is a fundamental responsibility of governments, is to be there to support communities and people in these natural disasters or in these extreme and tragic events. So it's a core responsibility of our government, one that we, I think, have shown that we're happy to embrace and to undertake in the most thoughtful and generous way possible. We have reliable and willing provincial partners. That is obviously reassuring to us. As the infrastructure minister, you noted we have started billions of dollars of programs in terms of climate change, adaptation, mitigation, increasing resiliency. I will be talking to my cabinet colleagues over the coming months, and I hope in anticipation of a budget next year, of how we can find the right way to have federal programs in partnership with provinces and municipalities in some cases to deal with public infrastructure. But there, you can imagine that there's sort of two streams of conversation: rebuilding resilient, adaptable public infrastructure that's safe and usable for communities, and then looking at the best way to ensure that private losses are appropriately protected. Is a different conversation, but we're prepared to do both, and we're engaged in exactly those two now.
Marina van Stackelberg, CBC.
Hi there, Minister Anand, you mentioned that more military has been brought in. Do you expect that number to increase as well? Do you have an idea of timeline as to how long the military might be needed in these provinces?
Okay, so on the question of timeline, we'll be there for as long as we are needed. The federal assistance is evaluated every single day, multiple times a day. This is the top priority right now domestically for us, and it's for that reason that I use the phrase all hands on deck, because this is what we are engaged in. In terms of numbers, as I said in response to questions in English and French already, we began with the approximately 3 platoons worth of Canadian soldiers in each of the provinces that had provided requests for assistance. That has increased to approximately 6. We are hovering around 150 soldiers per province right now. So you can see that the trajectory has been on the incline, and we are prepared to deploy more troops if the efforts that are being undertaken in these provinces are requiring more troops. So, for example, in Nova Scotia, the primary activities of the Canadian Armed Forces right now are in assisting with transportation links, clearing debris from transportation links. In PEI, the focus is more on restoring the power grid. In Newfoundland, the focus is on wellness checks. And so that's the type of activity that we're undertaking, really rooted in what the needs of the provinces are as specified in the requests for assistance. But as I said, I am in daily contact with the premiers, as is my colleague, Minister LeBlanc, and we will continue to update our federal response as needed by the provinces. This is our priority, and we'll make sure we get it done in conjunction with the provinces, as well as with the volunteers, the Red Cross, the hydro companies, the first responders. I mean, this is really what one would call a team effort writ large.
I wanted to know if you have an updated number of how many homes have been lost and what the federal government is doing to help people who need shelter right now.
So, Marina, obviously the provincial authorities are the ones doing this exact kind of evaluation. We have embedded in provincial emergency management operations centers in every province officials from public safety, from the armed forces. My colleagues could probably add details, but this is sort of a seamless effort led by provincial authorities in terms of evaluating private losses. My conversations with premiers has been around the idea that when they have that exact information that you properly raised, they should prepare submissions under these existing federal provincial agreements. And obviously the Government of Canada will be there in the appropriate financial way to support them. But that is very much the work that's being done by the provincial authorities, literally as we sit here this morning. But maybe Anita has more information from some of the military officials embedded in these provincial emergency management agencies.
I believe we have time to go to very small questions and follow-ups on Zoom, starting with Zhaoli Lee from CBC News.
Hi, I'm not sure which minister this would be for, but it's a question on the federal government matching Red Cross donations. Is the federal government open to matching donations made to other relief organizations or charities?
This is an issue that is with Minister Blair and Minister Blair's team, generally speaking, and I believe they're exploring a number of possibilities, but I would leave it to him to comment on specifically, as I don't have that information.
Thanks. And as an unrelated follow-up, you mentioned that the Canadian forces would be there as long as is necessary, but that's kind of an indefinite answer. What have the soldiers themselves been told? How long have they been told to expect that they may be expected to help out and pitch in?
The bottom line is until the work that is specified in the RFA is complete. And so there is a real sense of purpose among the Canadian Armed Forces in terms of ensuring that the job is done. And it is for that reason that I'd like to thank all members of the Canadian Armed Forces for really putting service above self, especially in this time of need in Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec.
Thank you. Next up, Shayna Locke, CBC.
Minister LeBlanc, we're getting reports of widespread outages in cell phones, internet, landlines. We understand storms will be getting worse. What specific actions will your government take to direct telecoms companies to make their systems more resilient against climate change?
I think you've identified an issue that certainly has affected these communities in the aftermath of Fiona, but again, we're all thinking of recent events, extreme weather events, where this exact kind of service, which has now become an essential service for communities, for first responders, for families, has been interrupted. So I have, over the last few days, spoken with our colleague, François-Philippe Champagne, who has responsibility in terms of regulating these particular sectors, the telecommunications sector. I think we can certainly serve notice on the telephone companies, on the internet service providers, that they are expected to do everything they have to do to ensure redundancies in their systems, to build up the resilience of, in some cases, this infrastructure, because it is now essential for the safety and security of communities. The good news is they're telling us, and they're telling our colleague François-Philippe Champagne, that they're anxious to do that. They are doing that. They're sharing resources as amongst themselves. So if different private companies have resources that other companies need to quickly restore or to strengthen redundancy of systems, they're doing that amongst themselves. But there certainly is an oversight role for our government to make sure that that work is being done, and we'll continue to do that. And I can ask my colleague François-Philippe Champagne, as you know, who's returning back to Canada from the funeral in Japan for the late Prime Minister, he could perhaps provide an update. But his discussions with me in the last couple of days has been very much on the point that you raised. And again, I would be, as Minister of Infrastructure, happy to work with provincial and territorial governments if we want to build into future infrastructure programming the way to strengthen the resiliency of telecommunications infrastructure. I would be open to those conversations as we're renewing the federal, provincial, territorial infrastructure programs over the coming months.
Thanks for that, Minister. You mentioned briefly serving notice upon the telecoms companies of your expectations. When would you expect to do that? And would there be any kind of enforcement attached if you made those kind of communications?
So again, that properly is a question that my colleague François-Philippe Champagne could answer in terms of what are the federal regulatory instruments that would be at our disposal. I don't want to mislead you in terms of specific regulatory instruments But if you're asking, have we served notice on these telephone companies, on these service providers, that they're expected to do everything they can to build up the resiliency of this infrastructure and to work collaboratively, I've just done that. So I'm very clear on behalf of the Government of Canada that we expect them to accept this responsibility. And the reassuring thing is what we're hearing from all of these companies, that they also accept this responsibility. So I'm confident that they'll continue to do what they have to do, and the Government of Canada will obviously be there to ensure everything we can do to facilitate and to enable this kind of rebuilding and resilience. We will be doing exactly that. And my colleague, I'll make sure that François-Philippe Champagne is able to give you precisions on exactly what his conversations have been, but I'm encouraged by what he's telling me in terms of those discussions.
Thank you. Merci. I'm told that the time's up for this press conference. Merci beaucoup, messieurs, madame les ministres. Bonne journée.
Thank you very much, ministers. Have a nice day.